This morning, I want to preach on the church, because tomorrow is the feast of St. Joseph. And St. Joseph has a number of titles. In the Litany of St. Joseph, with which I'm sure you're all familiar, St. Joseph is addressed by various titles: as the protector of God's Holy Son, and as the protector of God's Mother. He is the patron of the dying, and he is also patron of the universal church. Now, in these last 20 dark years, I have on many occasions felt that St. Joseph is our hope, because the church has been going through the worst crisis in its history. And no doubt many souls have been lost, and practically all souls have been confused. But I've taken great comfort from the fact that from heaven, St. Joseph is looking down at the church of his foster son, and he's there to guide us. In many shrines of St. Joseph, one sees at the bottom of his statue the words "Ite ad Joseph," go to Joseph. And on my own experience, that is a course I can recommend to all of you. When I was confirmed, the confirmation name which was given to me was the name Joseph. And I've had him as a companion over a great part of my life. But this morning I want to preach about the oneness of the church. I don't use the word unity because that word unity has become a bit debased. In this rather sordid period through which we're going, there is so much ecumenical nonsense talked using that word unity. So instead of that, I want to use the old Anglo-Saxon term oneness, about the oneness of the church. And that is my subject this morning. Now, we all know, as Roman Catholics, that there is only one church. A plurality of churches is impossible. It can't be. There is one church because there is one Christ. And the church is the extension of the mind and the will of Christ down through human history till the end of the world. So it's totally impossible that there should be more than one church. And that one church, let me say quite dogmatically, is the one holy, Catholic, and apostolic church, which is the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church is the true Church of Christ, and there is no other. Now, that is a very dogmatic statement, but it is the dogma of our holy church, of our holy faith. That statement that there's only one church is no doubt judged by the standards of our age, and judged by the standards of that church which still calls itself Roman Catholic, but isn't, the Conciliar Church. By the standards of that church, that is a bigoted remark that I just made. Well, I'm a bigot. And what's more, I'm going to continue being one. Because there is only one church, and that is the doctrine of our holy church. Now, there's only one church, as I say, because there's only one Christ. And that church is his mystical body in history. Now, almost from the day of Pentecost, stretching down the centuries, the oneness of the church has been constantly challenged. False prophets, heretics, penetrators of different kinds have come into the church from paganism, latterly from Freemasonry, communism, liberalism, and they've tried to undermine the oneness of the church. And they've caused confusion amongst the followers of Christ. But all through history, at least in the early ages, whenever there was a heresy which arose, the church called a council. And the heresy was condemned, and those who propagated it were excommunicated. The exception to that is the Lost Council, Vatican II. In that, the heretics were not thrown out. They were embraced. They were patted on the back. They were the good guys, to use a slang term of Vatican II. They got control of it. And so the Church of Christ was reduced to a tiny remnant in the world. Now, going back in history, one of the greatest tragedies that happened to the church was the split between the Church of the East and the Church of the West. It goes back to the first Christian emperor, Constantine the Great. Constantine, at the beginning of the 4th century, in around 320, was fighting a battle. This was before he was emperor. He was fighting a battle at a bridge just north of Rome, the Milvian Bridge, Ponte Milviano. And before the battle began, he had a vision. He saw in the sky a cross surrounded with light. And below the cross were written the words, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign conquer. And he went into battle believing in the cross and its efficacy, and he won the battle, and he became the first Catholic emperor of Rome. And the church entered into a period of peace and tranquility, having been persecuted before. Now, Constantine the Great decided to move his capital away from Rome to a new city on the banks of the Bosphorus. And he gave that new city his own name and called it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. And that began as a Christian city. And the generosity of Constantine himself and of his mother, St. Helena, filled that city with magnificent churches, chief of which is the great church of Santa Sophia, one of the greatest churches of the world. In 1457, that church, when the Turks conquered Constantinople, became a Mohammedan mosque. And today it's nothing. It's neither a mosque nor a church. But when one enters it, one feels the greatness of our holy faith and its magnificence. So Constantine erected his capital there. Now, Constantinople was Greek-speaking. Rome was Latin-speaking. And between the church in the east and the west, there grew up quite a difference. That difference was reflected in liturgy. It was reflected to a certain extent in certain points of doctrine. And it was reflected in customs. For example, the church in the east calculates Easter according to the old calendar. We calculate it according to the new, and with 13 days difference. The liturgy of the Eastern Church is much more complex, much more elaborate than our liturgy, but it still is a Mass. It's the true Mass. All the elements needed for the validity of the Mass are present in the rite of the Greek Orthodox Church, which is the Church of the East, as in the Byzantine rites. Nevertheless, this was a great tragedy. And finally, this difference between East and West became a split. And that split goes on till this day. The Greek Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church are not in real communion with each other. The Greek Orthodox Church, although it's not defined as heretical, it is defined as schismatic, because it left the body of the Roman Catholic Church, although it recognizes that the Bishop of Rome is the chief bishop of Christendom. Now, that was the first great split in the seamless robe of Christ. Now, the second great split began in the 16th century in the west of Europe. In a monastery in Germany, there was an Augustinian monk, and his name was Martin Luther. He was born 500 years ago last year. He was a very devout, believing Roman Catholic, but he had a great struggle with himself. He was subject to, more than usually, to the fleshly lusts and passions. And he struggled in his monk cell night after night, wondering whether he was going to achieve salvation or whether he would burn in hell forever. And this almost drove him crazy, this thought that he might be damned. And so gradually his mind took a turn off from the truth of our faith. And he invented a new doctrine of justification, which is not the doctrine of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. And that led him into a conflict with the then Pope. It led him into serious deviations from the faith. And it finally meant a new split in the body of Christ. The doctrines of Luther went through the air of Europe at that time like some deadly germ invasion. And at the end of the Protestant Reformation period, after bloody wars had been fought, after the soil of what is now Germany was drenched in blood and a third of its population had perished, Protestantism had conquered most of Germany, all of Scandinavia, most of Holland, and all practically of England and Scotland. It had penetrated even into France, and even to some extent into the Catholic countries like Spain and Italy. And so there was another great split and an exodus from the church. And this was a terrible tragedy. Now, the effects of these two great splits have not only been religious, they've been political and social. Today, the world is divided between East and West, with the Iron Curtain running down the middle. Now, that is partly due, only partly I say, to this split that goes back centuries in the church, when the East developed along one line and the West along another, and misunderstanding came between the two. The unity of the church could have avoided a great deal of that, but the split came. Then Protestantism came, and it split Europe again into North and South. And again, this has had social and economic and political repercussions. Probably some of the great wars we've fought in the last several centuries could have been avoided had that split not taken place, if Christendom had been a unity. But these were the great tragedies of Christendom. However, through the grace of God, and I have no doubt through the intercession of St. Joseph, just when several million people in Europe left the church, Columbus had just discovered before that, the New World, and the Spanish and Portuguese and the French, all Catholic nations, came in and conquered a large part of that new discovery for the Holy Roman Catholic Church. So the result is that from the Rio Grande River south, all the countries there became Catholic. And so a great deal of the numbers that were lost in the Protestant Reformation were regained in these discoveries and explorations and colonizations. Also, in the last few centuries since the Protestant Reformation, a great stream of converts has been returning to the church. And nowhere has that been more evident than in the English-speaking countries. Now, all the English-speaking countries of the world, with the one exception of Ireland, all have a majority Protestant population, and the Roman Catholic Church is a minority. But it's precisely in those countries that there has been an ever-widening, or there had been, I should say, an ever-widening stream of converts coming into the church. For example, in England, there was the great Cardinal Newman, and he was followed into the church by scores of Anglican clergy, and also by vast numbers of Anglican laity. And nowhere was that stream of converts more evident than in this great and wonderful country of the United States of America. That continued up until about 20 years ago. Now, I want to talk a little bit more concretely about this business of converts, because exactly 24 years ago today, I left the Anglican Church and was received into the Roman Catholic Church. This is the 24th anniversary of it. The road to Rome for me was a long road. In some ways it was a very hard road. There were tears along that road. It began, I remember so vividly, at the tomb of St. Francis Xavier in Portuguese India. I was an Anglican clergyman. I was an Anglican clergyman, incidentally, for about almost 25 years. I was not, as probably practically all of you are, born into the Roman Catholic Church. I was born into Protestantism. Anglicanism is the same as the Episcopal Church in this country. And I was born into that religion. And I became a clergyman. And the first part of my period as a clergyman out there, after a curacy in England, was as a missionary in India. And just before the last war broke out, I made a trip to Goa in Portuguese India. It was a pilgrimage, really. Because in India I had become fascinated with the life of St. Francis Xavier, that great Jesuit companion of St. Ignatius Loyola, and the greatest missionary, I believe, since St. Paul. So I went down to Goa, and I spent 27 days there. I spent 27 days there because that gave me time for 3 novenas of 9 days each. Mind you, I was an Anglican clergyman. I was a Protestant at the time. Well, I made my 3 novenas. And at the end of those 3 novenas, I knew where the road had to lead. I knew I was on the road to Rome. But it's a long road, very long. But I got there, through the grace of God. There were false starts. You know, when you root up your religious roots, it always presents difficulties. When I go around our circuit in this country, I come across so many families that are split now religiously. The husband goes to Novus Ordo, the wife comes to the traditional group. And it causes a great deal of difficulties in the family. I know of 2 or 3 cases where a couple of sisters don't speak to each other, because one is traditional, the other is Novus Ordo. Now, between Catholicism and Protestantism, there's been a great deal of misunderstanding over the last few centuries. And although I didn't come from one of these Orange Lodge type of Protestant families, nevertheless they were Protestant. They were very suspicious of Rome. So I encountered misunderstanding amongst my own relatives. Amongst my friends, even more so. And I remember when I became a Roman Catholic, things were uncomfortable. Most of them were little things, but little things can hurt, you know, as well as big things. If you're walking down the street and you see an old friend of yours whom you've known for years, and you see that when he sees you, he crosses the street, that makes a little stab here. I got some very nasty letters, using little 4-letter Anglo-Saxon words, which were not pleasant. I had some terrible telephone calls, one of them at midnight. And they called me by a very, very unpleasant term, which the only place I've ever heard it, that it was in the army. And this is a woman speaking. So there were some unpleasant things. It was a traumatic experience. And mind you, I was 50 when I became a Roman Catholic. You know, it's easier to uproot your roots, pull your roots up when you're young. But when you're already in middle life, it's a bit difficult. At any rate, I'm not trying to get sympathy. But this is the way it was. Well, I became a Roman Catholic 24 years ago today. The day before St. Joseph. On St. Joseph's Day morning, I made my first communion as a Roman Catholic. My first communion, period. I was confirmed. And I was happy as could be. I thought it's worth all that I've been through about these unpleasant things, because at last I'm in the truth. Now I can have peace and tranquility for the rest of my life. The ships come into harbor. And so, 3 years after I became a Roman Catholic and having left the Anglican Church, a traumatic experience, 3 years after that, the Roman Catholic Church became Anglican. I said to myself, God help us. What do I do now? Well, I had to pray a lot. I had to think a lot. And for a long time, I just simply didn't know what to do. I was just utterly and totally confused. But then I thought back to my reception to the church. I remember kneeling down in front of that altar, and I abjured the heresy of Anglicanism. And I've repeated my belief in the Roman Catholic Church. And I accepted this Mass which I'm saying now. And I thought, well, I'm going to be a Roman Catholic. I became one. I'm going to continue being one. And I'm not leaving the church, but the church has left me. So bye-bye. Let it go. I'm staying where I was when I entered the church. And that was where the church has always been since its beginnings. The true faith. And I'm having nothing to do with this counterfeit, bogus, new ecumenical religion that won out after Vatican II. And that is propagated and supported by the enemies of the church. The Freemasons, the atheists, the communists, and all the rest of them, who are enemies of our holy faith and enemies of the cross of Christ. Why should I have anything to do with that bogus stuff? I felt betrayed. And I was betrayed, and so were you. I believe it was the biggest betrayal in history next to that of Judas Iscariot by Judas Iscariot of our Lord. It was the biggest swindle in history. And it was perpetrated by the leaders of the church. Mind you, I think most of those bishops in the Council of Vatican II, I don't think they knew what they were doing. They didn't see the whirlwind that was entering the church. They were subject to the taunts of all these periti, these experts so-called, in the council, who were going around saying, you mustn't be old-fashioned, you've got to be up-to-date. We've got to bring the church up-to-date. The term aggiornamento and Catholicism, those two terms are mutually exclusive. They have nothing to do with each other. The church, if it changes, is no longer the church. So I decided, here I stand and here I stay. So thank God for that. But I didn't find that peace and tranquility which I'd hoped for. The last 20 years have been fighting all the way. And we're still fighting. But it's become a joyous fight. And, as the old song went, praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. Well, at any rate, that's my own personal experience. I don't like to talk about myself like this, but it happens to be the 24th anniversary today. And since I'm preaching here, and St. Joseph's Day tomorrow, and my life has been very much entwined with St. Joseph for these last 24 years. So I want to preach on that subject. But now, the church in this country, I believe, is one of the miracles of all history, of all church history. The church started out here in the United States of America, or back in the 13 colonies, with everything against it. All 13 colonies, with Maryland included, which had been founded by a Roman Catholic Lord Baltimore, all 13 colonies persecuted the Catholics. Feeling everywhere was against the church. It was a solidly Protestant country. All the countries that entered into the colonizing of the 13 colonies, the Dutch, the Swedes, the English, they were all Protestant countries, and they persecuted the church. The penal laws of England were imported in this country, chiefly in Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia. Then down history, the church had to contend every step of the way with misunderstanding, with prejudice, with even persecution. A Catholic could not be elected president of this country until about 20 years or so ago. And there's still enormous feeling, especially in the South, against the church. So the church has had to cope with every conceivable type of difficulty. And yet, on the eve of Vatican II, the Roman Catholic Church was the supreme moral and spiritual force in this land. It produced great men. Whenever I go to Baltimore to say Mass, which is fairly frequently, I have one thing that I always ask them to do there. And they always do it without my saying a word. They sing as the first hymn before Mass, Faith of Our Fathers. And that was written by a great Cardinal Archbishop of Baltimore, Cardinal Gibbons, who was one of the great Roman Catholics of this country. Another great cardinal of this country, a great leader of this country, was Cardinal Mundelein of Chicago. He built a magnificent seminary just outside of Chicago on a lake there. I went to it one day, a week after a Chicago blizzard. It's magnificent. It was the largest seminary in the world. There were 6 enormous dormitories there, a chapel of cathedral dimensions, a wonderful library. Today, I believe they use just one of those dormitories. They've got a pathetic little group of students huddled in there, including a few women. And that's all that's left of Cardinal Mundelein's great seminary. But probably the greatest of all, and the best known, was Cardinal Spellman of New York. He was a wonderful man. He was a great Catholic and he was a great American. During all the years of American involvement in Vietnam, he spent every Christmas with the troops, the U.S. troops in Vietnam, because he believed supremely in the destiny of this country. And he believed that the destiny of America and the destiny of the Roman Catholic Church were much intertwined. And he saw a sort of in the distance there, he saw a rosy streak in the sky. He saw the vision of a Catholic America. That was something which was not to have come in a week or a month or a year or 10 years, but it was there, and he saw it. He saw coming the day when the Roman Catholic Church would have conquered this country, and America would be predominantly a Roman Catholic country. And how wonderful that would be for the world. The most powerful nation in the world aligned with the true Church of Christ. What a great force for good that would have been in the world, for peace, for the happiness of folk everywhere. But just at the moment when the Roman Catholic Church was at the very height of its power and influence, what did it do? I'll tell you what it did. It committed suicide. It committed suicide. Would you believe it? There was festering inside of its body a horrible, diseased death wish, propagated by the enemies of the church, inside the church. Freemasons, atheists, progressives so-called, liberals, modernists. They were all there working. It was like yeast, but a sickly, nasty yeast working in this body of the church. They got control of that Vatican II, and the result, the demolition of the church. Think of it, that great rock in the middle of our human history, that wonderful, unchanging church, has degenerated into that pathetic thing that we see around us. That church of the clown masses, that church of the resolution bishops, with their silly resolutions against nuclear armament and nuclear energy in general to a great extent. People like the Archbishop of Seattle, who won't pay half of his income tax because he doesn't want it to go to the armament of this country. The one in Saginaw, Michigan, who asks his parishioners to call him Ken. His first name's Kenneth. Who said it's better to be red than dead. And who says there isn't any heaven, there isn't any hell, there isn't any purgatory. When we die, we go straight to God. That's the new religion. Bishop Sullivan of Virginia, who tolerates with pleasure a priest in his diocese who says Superman masses, dressed up like Superman, but going back behind the altar to change and become Clark Kent. That sort of thing. Not even the most primitive Negro sects in Georgia have descended to this sort of lack of dignity. And this is that great church with the most superb liturgy in the world and the home of saints. The church of the dancing nuns. The church of the howling dervishes. How terrible. And we're all victims of it. However, our blessed Lord, our divine Lord, does not desert his church. It's his mystical body. He can't desert it. He promised that he would be with it till the end of the world, and he is with it. But let's remember that the doctrine of the Bible is the doctrine of the remnant. After Noah, there was a remnant. After the return of Israel from Babylon, there was a remnant that carried on. And so it is in the new Israel, the church, and we're the remnant. And we're with us. And in heaven, St. Joseph looks down at us, and he sees us in our struggles. He sees us even in our pettiness and our quarrels, but he sees us and he's with us. And so long as he's there, and our Blessed Lady is there, and above all our Blessed Lord is there, there's nothing to fear. We can go on. So, I'm sorry to talk about myself as I've done this morning, and I know it's sort of embarrassing in a way. But it does happen to be a rather significant day for me. I remember so vividly what happened 24 years ago today and tomorrow. And since then, St. Joseph's been with me in every step of the way. So, ite a Joseph, go to Joseph.